The most powerful comeback in the world doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, and by the time anyone notices, it has already been happening for a long time. That is the first thing to understand about what we are going to examine in this conversation. Because the word comeback carries cultural baggage that will actively mislead you if you don't just set it down before we go any further. The cultural framework for a comeback is almost always performative. It involves a visible fall followed by a visible rise. A public low point acknowledged and then transcended. A return to the arena, announced and witnessed, with the implicit audience of people who observed the falling and are now invited to observe the rising. That framework is not what we are talking about here. The empath's silent comeback shares almost nothing with that architecture except the end result. And even the end result, when it arrives, carries a quality that the performed comeback never possesses. A quality of settledness, of completion, of someone who has arrived somewhere real rather than somewhere staged. What makes the empath's comeback silent is not that it happens in the absence of difficulty or pain. It is that it happens in the absence of audience. The empath who enters the process that produces this particular kind of transformation has, almost always, reached a point where the performance of recovery, the reassuring of worried friends, the managing of the narcissist's perception of their state, the continuous outward translation of an interior experience that was already overwhelming before it had to be translated, has become simply impossible. Not chosen to be stopped. Impossible to continue. The resources that performing required have been depleted past the point of access. And in that depletion, something unexpected happens. The silence that was initially the forced consequence of exhaustion begins, gradually, and then with increasing momentum, to become something else. It begins to become the condition in which the real work can finally happen. This is the insight that I find most important to convey, and most difficult to convey to someone who is still close to the wound, still in the early stages of the silence, still experiencing the absence of performance primarily as loss rather than as liberation. The silence that follows the empath's breakdown is not a void. It is a space. And the distinction between a void and a space is everything, because a void is empty in a final and unredeemable sense, while a space is empty in the way that a room is empty before it is furnished. The emptiness is the condition for what comes next, not the content of what is. What comes next is the work that none of the people observing the empath's silence can see. The honest, often painful, completely private process of examining what happened, not to assign blame, not to construct the narrative that will eventually be shared with others, but to actually understand, to look at the relationship, the dynamic, the empath's own history and psychology, and the ways in which that history made them available to what the relationship required of them, to look at all of it with the kind of clear-eyed, compassionately honest attention that Mate's framework of self-inquiry calls us toward. Not self-blame, not the rehabilitation of the narcissist, but the genuine, undefended examination of a complete human experience in all of its complexity. That examination, conducted in the silence that no audience has access to, is where the rebuilt self begins to take shape. Not announced, not performed, not organized around what it will look like when it is eventually revealed to the world that it witnessed the breakdown. The comeback was never for them. It was never about the shock it would produce, the narrative it would resolve, the story it would complete for the people who had written the empath off. It was, from the first quiet moment of its beginning, simply a person deciding, in private, that their life was worth the work of rebuilding it the same way. There is a moment that nobody warns you about. The moment when you stop trying to hold yourself together and discover that the falling apart was the beginning. And I want to approach this with the care it deserves, because this is the point in the conversation most vulnerable to being heard as romanticization of suffering, as though the breakdown is something to be welcomed, something to be leaned into with spiritual enthusiasm, something that the empath should feel grateful for in the moment of its most acute and most devastating expression. That is not what this is. The breakdown that precedes the silent comeback is not beautiful in the moment of its happening. It is not a cinematic collapse with a clear narrative arc and a guaranteed resolution visible from the floor. It is, in its immediate and lived experience, simply terrible. It is the specific terror of a person whose entire framework for managing their existence, The strategies, the accommodations, the extraordinary and exhausting competence at functioning in the presence of ongoing harm has finally exceeded its load capacity and given way. What happens in that moment, and why it matters so completely to what comes after it, is something that trauma psychology has been attempting to describe with increasing precision for several decades. Bessel van der Kolk, Peter Levine, and the researchers working in the somatic trauma tradition have documented with remarkable consistency that the nervous system's responses to sustained relational harm, the hypervigilance, the freeze, the chronic low-level activation that characterize the empaths' daily existence inside the narcissistic relationship, are not resolved by insight alone. They are not resolved by understanding what happened, however clear and however complete that understanding becomes. They require something more fundamental. They require the completion of physiological processes that were initiated by the original experience of threat, and that were never allowed to run their full course, because the too much in environment that produced them was still present, still active, still requiring the empath to maintain functional competence in the presence of ongoing activation. The breakdown is, in this framework, not a failure of the empath's resilience. It is the nervous system's delayed completion of what the relational environment had been, preventing it from completing. The grief that was suppressed because expressing it was unsafe. The rage that was managed because expressing it was dangerous. The full, unmediated experience of what was actually happening, what had actually been happening, that the empath's extraordinary capacity for functional management had been holding at bay long past the point at which holding it had become the primary occupation of their psychological life. When that holding finally releases, when the empath stops fighting the breakdown and allows what has been accumulating to move through completely, what happens is not the destruction of the self. It is the destruction of the managed, performed, continuously maintained version of the self that the relationship required. And that version, however necessary it was in the environment that produced it, was never the empath's authentic self. It was the adaptive construction that kept them functional. And its dissolution, however terrifying in the moment, clears the ground for something that the adaptive construction was always, by its very nature, obscuring. The authentic self does not emerge from the breakdown polished and complete. It emerges uncertain, tentative, raw in the specific way that anything newly uncovered is raw, exposed to air it hasn't felt before, sensitive in ways that will eventually become strengths, but that in the early one pulls. The empath who allows themselves to be in this rawness, without rushing it, without performing recovery for an audience that would be more comfortable with a quicker resolution, is doing the most important work of their entire life. The breakdown was not the end of you. It was the end of the version of you. That was never going to be enough. For the life that was always waiting on the other side of it, silence, in the hands of someone who has finally chosen it for themselves, is not the absence of power. It is its purest expression. And this requires a complete recalibration of how most people understand what silence communicates. Because we live inside a cultural framework that has pathologized quiet with a thoroughness that is itself worth examining. The cultural assumption is that silence is passive, that the person who has gone silent is the person who has been defeated, who has withdrawn from the field, who has conceded the narrative to whoever is still speaking. And for the empath whose silence is being observed and interpreted by the people who were accustomed to their continuous availability, the narcissist, the mutual friends, the family members who depended on the empath's engagement as a kind of relational infrastructure, that assumption produces a very specific and very consequential misreading. They see the silence and conclude that the empath has been reduced, that the relationship, the breakdown, the disappearance from the shared social world has produced in the empath a diminishment that confirms whatever narrative they had constructed about why things ended the way they did. They are reading the wrong thing entirely. What the empath's silence actually represents, at the level of what is actually happening in the person who chose it, is something that most of the people observing it from the outside have never themselves experienced and therefore have no adequate framework for recognizing. It is the first genuine act of self-sovereignty the empath has performed, perhaps in years, perhaps ever in the full and conscious sense of the word. Because every act of self-expression that preceded this silence was, to varying degrees, produced in relation to someone else, in response to someone else's behavior, in service of someone else's emotional management, calibrated to what the relational environment required rather than what the empath's interior truth was actually generating. Even the empath's most genuine moments of self-expression within the narcissistic relationship were occurring inside a frame that the narcissist had constructed, and that the empath was, however unknowingly, accepting as the given condition of what was expressible. The silence removes the frame, and what the empath discovers in the frameless space that the silence creates is something that the continuous noise of a relationship organized around the narcissist needs had made effectively inaccessible. They discover what they actually think, what they actually feel, beneath the layers of management and performance and strategic self-modulation that the relationship had required. What they actually want, not as an abstract aspiration, but as a lived, embodied, present-tense reality that belongs entirely to them and requires no one else's present endorsement to be legitimate. There is a concept in contemplative psychology that is relevant here, what the Buddhist tradition calls the beginner's mind, and what Mate's framework approaches through the lens of present-moment awareness. The idea that genuine self-knowledge is not arrived at through accumulation, through the adding of more frameworks, more analysis, more externally sourced understanding of who one is, but through a kind of clearing, a willingness to be in the not knowing long enough for what is actually true to surface without being immediately categorized, managed, or translated into something more socially legible. The empath's silence is this clearing. It is the willingness to not know what comes next, to not perform a recovery whose shape has not yet been revealed, to be in the raw and uncertain space between who they were and who they are becoming, without filling that space with the noise that would make it more comfortable for everyone observing it. The narcissist called your noise weakness and your silence defeat. They had it exactly backwards. Your noise was the accommodation. Your silence is the first thing you have done, entirely for yourself, Alforge. The narcissist didn't take your identity. They buried it. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Because taken implies permanent loss, implies that what was removed has gone somewhere, beyond recovery, that the self that existed before the relationship entered its dismantling phase is simply no longer available, that what the empath must build in the aftermath of narcissistic injury is something new from the ground up, because there is nothing left of the original to recover. And that understanding, while understandable given the depth of the damage, is precisely the understanding that the narcissist's most lasting wound installs. The belief that what they took cannot be reclaimed. That the self that was systematically deconstructed through devaluation, through gaslighting, through the patient and relentless replacement of the empath's self-perception with the narcissist's preferred version of them, that self is simply gone. It is not gone. It was never gone. It was buried under layers of the narcissist's construction, under the accumulated weight of being told consistently and convincingly that their perceptions were distorted, their needs were excessive, their sense of their own worth was a form of arrogance that the some relationship was mercifully correcting. Buried under the adaptive self that the empath built to survive the environment, the self that learned to be smaller, to need less, to apologize for taking up space, to locate its value entirely in its usefulness to someone who was consuming that usefulness without acknowledgement or reciprocity. The work of the silent comeback is, in large part, an archaeological one. There is something in Mate's understanding of authenticity, his insistence that the precedal, authentic self is not something to be constructed, but something to be recovered, that maps onto this process with extraordinary precision. The authentic self, in his framework, was present before the adaptations that concealed it. It was present in the child before the child learned which parts of themselves were acceptable to the environment they were born into, and which parts needed to be hidden or eliminated. It was present in the empath before the narcissistic relationship added its own systematic layers of concealment on top of whatever layers the empath's earlier relational history had already produced. And the process of recovering it is not invention. It is excavation. patient, non-linear, frequently surprising excavation, because the self that surfaces through this process is not always the self the empath expected to find. It is sometimes older than they remember, sometimes wilder, sometimes more certain, more opinionated, more unwilling to accommodate than the adaptive self ever allowed itself to be. What makes this excavation possible, what creates the conditions under which the buried self can actually surface, is precisely the silence that we examined in the previous section of this conversation. Because the buried self does not emerge in noise. It does not emerge in the continuous performance of functionality that characterized the two empaths' existence inside the narcissistic relationship. It emerges in the quiet, in the unstructured, unobserved, unevaluated moments when there is no relational quiet environment requiring the adaptive self to remain in operation. When the empath can simply, perhaps for the first time in years, be in their own company without simultaneously managing the emotional weather of the person beside them. And what they find in that company surprises them. Not always pleasantly, not always immediately, not always in ways they know how to integrate, but consistently. With a consistency that I have observed across years of working with people in recovery from relational harm, they find something, a preference, a conviction, a desire, a perception that they know to be accurate regardless of who has previously told them it wasn't. The small, quiet, unmistakably genuine signals of a self that was never destroyed, only waiting. In the dark beneath the construction, for someone to finally come looking me in. The body knows the way back before the mind does. And the empath's silent comeback begins, in ways most people never fully appreciate, in the body's quiet insistence on its own restoration. This is the dimension of recovery that the psychological frameworks, however sophisticated, however precise in their mapping of what narcissistic abuse does to the mind and the self-concept and the relational patterns, consistently underweight. Because the harm was not only psychological, it was physiological. It was registered in the body with the same thoroughness and the same lasting consequence as it was registered in the mind, and in some ways with greater consequence, because the body's record of sustained threat does not respond to insight the way the mind's does. You can understand, with complete intellectual clarity, exactly what happened and why. You can name the dynamics, trace the patterns, construct the most precise and accurate account of the relational history that produced your current state. And your nervous system can remain, beneath all of that understanding, in the chronic activation that the sustained experience of living in a threatening relational environment installed in it. Bessel van der Kolk's foundational work, the title of which has become something of a cultural touchstone, precisely because it captures something so clinically precise in so few words, documents this with a thoroughness that changed how trauma is understood and treated. The body keeps the score, not metaphorically, neurologically. The sustained stress responses that characterize the empath's existence inside the narcissistic relationship, the cortisol elevation, the hypervigilance, the constant low-level scanning of the environment for the next behavioral shift, the freeze responses that became the empath's default in the face of escalation, all of these leave measurable biological traces in the nervous system's regulatory capacity, in the immune system's function, in the quality of sleep, of digestion, of the basic physiological processes whose disruption most people around the empath attributed to stress without understanding the specific relational mechanism producing it. The empath's silent comeback addresses this, in the movement that slowly, incrementally begins to return to a body that had been held in chronic tension, in the sleep that begins to deepen as the hypervigilance that was always listening for the narcissist's approach gradually, tentatively begins to quiet, in the appetite that returns as the chronic cortisol elevation that had suppressed it begins to normalize, in the capacity for physical pleasure, for the simple, uncomplicated sensory enjoyment of warmth, of rest, of beauty encountered without the simultaneous monitoring of someone else's reaction to it, that begins to re-emerge in the absence of the relational environment that had made the present moment feel perpetually unsafe. And here is what the body's healing does that the mind's healing alone cannot accomplish. It changes the quality of presence, not the performed quality of presence, not the appearance of being settled and self-possessed, that the empath could, with effort, maintain even in the depths of their injury. The actual quality, the felt from the inside, registered in the nervous system quality of a person whose body is no longer in emergency, whose baseline is no longer activation, whose physical existence in the world has shifted from the chronic state of braced readiness that sustained threat produces to something closer to the natural, unguarded, genuinely present quality that is the body's default when it is allowed to return to it. Other people feel this before they can name it, before they have identified what specifically has changed, before they have consciously registered the differences in how the empath carries themselves, speaks, occupies space. They feel the shift. The nervous system is a remarkably sensitive receiver of other nervous system states, and a nervous system that has moved from chronic emergency to genuine settledness communicates that shift to every other nervous system it comes into proximity with. The body healed first, and the body's healing announced the comeback. Before the empath had said a single word, there is freedom that most people never experience. The freedom of a person who has stopped needing to explain themselves to people who were never genuinely interested in understanding them. And the empath's arrival at this freedom is one of the most quietly radical developments in the furious, empath arc of their silent comeback. Because the explanation habit, the compulsive, continuous, exhausting practice of justifying feelings, defending perceptions, providing elaborate context for decisions, translating interior experience into a form calibrated for external acceptance, was never just a personality trait. It was a survival adaptation, installed with the same precision and the same gradual thoroughness as every other adaptation. The empath developed in response to a relational environment that consistently communicated that their unmediated, unqualified, unapologetic self-expression was not acceptable as it arrived. Let's trace where the explanation habit actually originates, because understanding its aims is what makes its cessation comprehensible, as liberation rather than as the social and failure that the people who benefited from it will attempt to frame it as. The child who grew up in an environment where their emotional responses were consistently questioned, too much, too sensitive, overreacting, being dramatic, learned something that no child should have to learn. They learned that their interior experience as it naturally presented did not have automatic legitimacy, that it required justification before it would be received, that the burden of proof for their own feelings rested with them, that they were required to make a case for the validity of their own inner life before the people around them would grant it the basic acknowledgement that it deserved, simply by virtue of being real. That lesson, absorbed before the empath had the cognitive framework to evaluate or resist it, produced the adult who over-explains, who provides 3 sentences of context before stating a preference, who qualifies every emotional disclosure with the preemptive concession that they might be wrong, might be overreacting, might be seeing something that isn't there, despite the fact that their perceptual accuracy, as we have examined throughout this conversation, is almost always significantly higher than the people they are conceding to. The over-explanation was never a sign of uncertainty about what the empath actually thought and felt. It was the scar tissue of having had that certainty consistently challenged by people whose interest in challenging it was never the pursuit of truth. The narcissistic relationship added its own layer on top of this pre-existing adaptation, with devastating efficiency, because the narcissists need to be the arbiter of reality, to be the final authority on what actually happened, what it meant, and what the appropriate response to it was, found in the empaths. Sexplanation habit, the perfect operating condition. An empath who habitually justifies their experience is an empath who has already, before the conversation begins, conceded that their experience requires external validation to be legitimate. And that concession, the narcissist system recognized immediately, was the opening through which the systematic replacement of the empath's self-perception with the narcissist version could be most efficiently accomplished. The cessation of explanation in the empath's silent comeback is therefore not rudeness. It is not coldness. It is not the arrogance of someone who has decided their perspective requires no engagement. It is the organic expression of a self that has, through the sustained interior work of the silent comeback, rebuilt its relationship with its cop. own knowing to the point where external validation is no longer a structural requirement. The empath who no longer explains does not need you to agree with their perception in order to act on it, does not need your acknowledgement of their feeling in order to honor it, does not need your endorsement of their decision in order to implement it. Their inner world has become, finally, completely, and without apology, its own authority. And a person who is their own authority has nothing left to explain to someone who was never listening anyway. The people who watched you fall had years to form their conclusion about you. They formed it carefully, confidently, from the available evidence. And they were wrong about every single part of it. This is what makes the visibility of the empath's silent comeback so specifically and so completely disorienting for the people who witnessed the breakdown that preceded it. Not that the empath recovery, in some attenuated and manageable form, was perhaps within the range of what they expected, but the specific quality, the specific completeness, the specific version of the person who became visible when the invisible work was finally done, that is what produces the shock that the title of this conversation promises. Because the person who emerges is not a recovered version of the person who went down. It is someone they don't have an adequate category for. Someone who doesn't fit the narrative that was so carefully constructed in their absence. Let's examine how that narrative gets constructed, because understanding its architecture is what reveals why its collision with the reality of the empath's comeback is so cognitively and emotionally destabilizing for the people who built it. When someone goes silent, genuinely, comprehensively, in the way that the empath's silent comeback requires, the people around them do not simply wait in a state of neutral suspension for the silence to end. They interpret, they construct, from the available evidence, the breakdown they witnessed, the vulnerability they saw, the distance that has replaced the empath's previous availability, a story about what the silence means, about what kind of person would go so quiet for so long in the aftermath of what happened. And the story they construct is almost always organized around diminishment. The empath couldn't cope. The empath was more damaged than anyone realized. The empath retreated because they didn't have the resources to remain present. The narcissist, whose investment in this particular narrative is the most intense and the most strategically motivated, constructs the most elaborate version of it, sharing it with the mutual social network, with the same efficiency and the same practiced credibility that all characterized the original smear campaign. But here is the structural flaw in every narrative constructed about someone during their silence. It is built entirely from what was visible during the period of maximum damage, the lowest harm, the most depleted state, the version of the person produced by sustained harm rather than the version that existed before the harm and that has been, in the silence, being rebuilt. It is as though someone documented a forest in the immediate aftermath of a fire, all blackened ground and fallen timber, and declared that documentation to be the definitive record of what the forest is, without accounting for the growth that was already beginning beneath the ash, without being present for the spring that was coming regardless of whether they believed in it. The empath's comeback becomes visible all at once because the rebuilding happened entirely out of sight, in the interior spaces that the silence protected, in the private work that required no audience and produced no visible output until it was complete. And when it surfaces, when the rebuilt person re-enters the shared world, in whatever form that re-entry takes, the gap between the last visible version and the current one is so vast, so unaccounted for by the narrative, so completely inconsistent with the conclusion that was so confidently reached, that the only honest response available is the acknowledgement that everything they thought they knew was assembled from evidence gathered at the wrong time. You let them watch the winter. You did the spring in private, and now it is summer. And they are still holding their conclusions about what a winter person looks like. Everything that came before this moment was the making of you. And this moment, right now, wherever you are in the arc of what we have been discussing, is not the end of that making. It is the first moment you have been conscious enough, awake enough, sufficiently freed from the noise of everything the relationship installed in you to actually participate in it. That is what I want to leave you with. Not the comfort of a completed narrative, not the reassurance that the hard part is behind you and the reward is ahead, but something more honest and more sustaining than that. The recognition that the story the narcissist told about you, the story that said you were limited, that you were too much and not enough simultaneously, that you were incapable of the life you had imagined for yourself before the relationship contracted your sense of what was possible. That story was never about you. It was about what they needed you to believe in order to remain available. And you are here, having traveled through everything this conversation has examined, which means some part of you, perhaps a very quiet part, perhaps a part that has not yet fully consolidated its own authority, knows that the story was wrong. The prologue is a concept in literature that is frequently misunderstood. People tend to read it as the real beginning of the story, the foundational material that establishes the world the narrative will inhabit. But the prologue's actual function is different. It provides the context without which what follows cannot be fully understood. It is necessary, profoundly necessary, but it is not the story itself. And what I want you to understand, with whatever clarity this conversation has been able to produce, is that everything that preceded this moment in your life, the relationship, the idealization that made it feel like destiny, the devaluation that made you question your own reality, the discard or the leaving, or the endless cycle that preceded both, all of it, in the fullest and most accurate sense, was prologue. Not because it was unimportant, not because its cost was not real or its damage not genuine, but because the story it was setting up, the one that is beginning now, in the silence, in the invisible rebuilding, in the first tentative expressions of the authentic self that the silence has been allowing to surface, that story is of an entirely different order than anything the prologue contained. It is the story of a person who went all the way down and discovered that the bottom was solid, who was broken open and discovered that what was inside was worth the breaking, who lost the version of themselves that the relational environment required and found, in the loss, the version that was always there beneath the requirement. There is a quality to the chapter that follows a genuine silent comeback that I have observed consistently and that I find every time I encounter it genuinely moving. It is the quality of someone who is no longer performing their life, who has exited the relational environment that required the performance so completely, not just physically but psychologically, in the deepest orientation of their attention and their energy, that what replaces the performance is something that most people around them have never seen from them before. Simply the person in their actual fullness, living their actual life, making their actual choices, expressing their actual truth, without the continuous self-monitoring, the relational management, the translation of authentic experience into acceptable form that the previous chapter required. That person is not a recovered version of who you were before. They are the first version of who you actually are, and the story they are beginning, written in their own hand, on their own terms, for no audience but the life that is finally, completely, irreversibly theirs, is the only story that was ever worth telling.